Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. We will be looking at the various developments that happened across the world this week. And some of the very notable ones are the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist, which probably risks the inflammation of the conflict in this region, as former CIA chief John Brennan pointed out, that this could flare up situation in this area. Other than that, we've seen that the US President-elect Joe Biden is ready, almost ready, or putting together his new team. And most top three diplomats, at least, are alumni of the Obama White House. Other than that, India's External Affairs Minister is or has been on a trip 6-day trip to UAE, Bahrain, and Seychelles, and how important is that for India? All of that. But we want to begin with US President-elect Biden's selection of his team. He's giving shape, which is probably an indication of his foreign policy. So how should we look at the team that he selected, and at least the top three diplomats that he's selected, Antony Blinken, Linda Greenfield, and Jake Sullivan? These three at least are the alumni of Obama White House. Now, these are old hands. When we look at that, there is also the question that have they learned from the earlier mistakes or the dissatisfaction which probably led to Trump's election? And are they ready for the changes that have already taken place? Because foreign policy in these 4 years has taken a 180-degree turn. How will they fare in comparison to the team that Trump had?
Yeah, thanks, Naghma. I think, Mr. Biden has a very big challenge. He has a challenge that he has to define his own identity as a president, and his presidency, which should be, very distinct from Obama's legacy in some ways. So while he uses Obama administration's legacy, he has used that during the campaign. I think we also see the distancing that he's trying to do now. In one of his very first statements, he said this is not going to be Obama 3.0. So clearly, I think he recognizes that there are enormous challenges. The world has turned upside down in the last 4 years. Mr. Trump, and whatever he represents, that itself might in some ways be seen as a consequence of Obama's legacy. So in that context, I think he will have to, he has taken, at least on the foreign policy front, selected a team which is largely from the Obama camp, which is largely from those days. But I think, he has a difficult job here, because he had to convince a lot of America's allies and friends that America, as he says, America is back at the table, that America is now going to be much less, unlike Trump, which used to be episodic, which used to be ad hoc, the idea that Mr. Trump was running foreign policy by tweet. Now, he wants to convey that sense that perhaps there is going to be a bit of stability in the environment, and that's the reason why he has chosen the names, especially the foreign policy team in particular. But that has already generated, a kind of a response from the so-called progressives within the American system, within the Democratic Party, which are already looking at it and saying, well, did people really vote Obama once again, or is this simply his, have we not learned anything from the past 4 years? So I think for Mr. Biden, of course, there are a number of other appointments still left, and he can balance them out. But at the moment, I think in his effort to reassure the world, in his effort to reassure the allies, he has chosen people like Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Linda Greenfield, all of them veterans, and all of them so-called establishment candidates, to convey a sense of, that there'll be less disruption under his administration. That I think, while the world may have changed and he will have to adapt himself and his administration, people who have thought about these issues seriously and for a longer period of time are needed perhaps to manage American ship in these turbulent waters. And I think that's the message that perhaps he's trying to give out to the world, and especially to his to America's allies and friends.
And top of the agenda would be rejoining a lot of those organizations that Trump walked out of, the alliances, the treaties, because the shift has been about 180 degrees if you look at the foreign policy. So that's one of the big challenges. And like you mentioned, to prove once again that America's back and the credibility, USA's staying power, all that will be a big challenge. There are many challenges that he's facing. We just mentioned Jake Sullivan here, who was one of the key negotiators in the Iran nuke deal. Harsh, he's very keen. Biden is very keen to re-look at the Iran nuclear deal and rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal, which Trump walked out of. But the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist, that kind of impedes his ambition of rejoining the nuclear deal, doesn't it? Because all the intelligence that is coming in is saying that there is no doubt that Israel was behind this, though Israel has said nothing. Now we have to see how does it affect the whole prospect of Biden re-looking at the Iran nuclear deal.
I think, Naghma, it's not simply, and I'll come to the Iranian nuclear deal, but you had started with the question of, other UN agencies, multilateral frameworks, climate change. Of course, that's the easy part. He has already appointed, John Kerry, the climate czar, his climate czar. So I think that's going to be relatively easy because there is widespread consensus. Even those countries who at one point used to be critical of American climate change policies, like China and India, are now mostly on board as far as the climate change, as far as the global approach to climate change is concerned. So I don't think he's going to face a challenge there. He's also, I think America will be welcomed if Mr. Biden starts joining the UN agencies one by one. And I think, Linda Greenfield will have will be widely welcomed in the UN system, in the multilateral system. But as we have been talking, the world has changed, the world has evolved. Even multilateralism, the idea of multilateralism is going through a fundamental reconfiguration. We are no longer in the world where we used to say, the UN system, how great that is. Indian Prime Minister has spoken about it very, very directly. During the COVID-19 pandemic, UN was absolutely missing. UN agencies were being manipulated. So clearly there is a lot of discontent which has arisen about the present state of affairs in the multilateral order. And I don't think it's going to be business as usual that that Americans can now join once again. I think even in America, there is a lot of criticism. So I think even when you look at the multilateral question, my sense is that while Mr. Biden will certainly like America to join it much more vigorously, but he would also demand major reforms, because that's one aspect of Mr. Trump's legacy that resonates across political parties in America. American voters want America, at the moment, the signals are that they want very limited engagement with the world, and an engagement where they seem to be gaining something out of it. So if the idea is that instead of they gaining, the Chinese are gaming the system, then I think Mr. Biden will have a problem. So even on the multilateral aspect, I think he's going to face enormous problems in terms of going back to the Obama era or even Clinton era liberal internationalism. But I think on the question of JCPOA, which is clearly, there's Jake Sullivan who negotiated it. His own Mr. Biden himself had been a strong voter. And of course, it was seen at that point in time, one of the biggest achievements of an otherwise lackluster Obama foreign policy. But what is happening in the Middle East today is completely different in terms of the larger geopolitical and geoeconomic trends than you had witnessed 4 or 5 years back when JCPOA came to fruition. And, it's not, yes, we have had the assassination of the Iranian scientist, but we have also seen the larger structural shift of how close the Arab Gulf states and Israel, they have come together. The recent visit of the Israeli secret visit to the Saudis and how the possibility of rapprochement, the Saudis apparently did not agree this time. But clearly we know that, these are the trend lines that are developing. And what I think is happening is that countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia are laying down a marker for the Biden administration. Then don't be fooled that just because you have won in American election, you can come back and restore JCPOA. We don't like JCPOA, and we will do everything in our power to make sure that JCPOA does not become a possibility.
So does this assassination, sorry for interrupting there, Harsh, but this assassination is seen as a one step that Israel has taken in that direction to kind of impede the diplomacy that Biden was so keen on reviving. And you're saying that the situation is really not the same. It's happening simultaneously when the Arab-Israel axis is strengthening and we see further alienation of Iran. So you are saying that it won't be very easy for Biden to go back to that relationship or restoring the diplomacy that he was aiming at, which was there 4 years back.
Yes, absolutely. Because, the Middle East has changed and he will have to find, he will have to reconfigure JCPOA in line with present day realities. He can't just go back and take the Obama template and say, look, we already had a deal. Let's all go back to that deal. Mm-hmm. Neither the Iranians will agree to it, nor the other parties will agree to it. And already, as we have been discussing, the other stakeholders are trying to make it very clear that they don't like what Mr. Biden might bring to the table, and therefore they are laying down new red lines. So if the Iranian assassination, the assassination of the Iranian scientist is any indication, we are going to see greater turbulence as Mr. Biden, gets to the high table, and we also know where Mr. Trump's sympathies lie. So clearly, there is still almost 1.5 month period which remains, and much can happen during that time. And for Biden administration, therefore, to go back to status quo ante would not be possible. And I would say many would argue that Biden will have to think whether it is even desirable in the present circumstances, that maybe there is an alternative to JCPOA that he'll have to create, because clearly Iranians will also question, why should we trust America now? After all, what has happened in the past, yes, and what is happening, in terms of the Arab Gulf and Israel axis that is emerging. Clearly, the Arab Gulf states, interestingly now, Mr. Biden says that he wants to work with allies. Now, who are the closest allies in the Middle East? It's the Arab Gulf states. So if you want to work with the allies, you will have to take their considerations into account. One of the biggest problems and one of the biggest issues that Obama faced was that he was seen as a president who was turning his back on America's long-standing allies in the region. And I think now if Mr. Biden is coming back and saying, well, I want to work with my allies, then he can't have one standard for Europeans and another standard for Middle Eastern countries. So I think there are enormous questions here which will emerge over the course of the next 1 month or so. Yes. And I'm very skeptical that the kind of JCPOA model that we have had in the past can be replicated again. But clearly, Mr. Biden would try to revive something along those lines so that the Iranian nuclear question can be handled, because we all know that Iran's nuclear issue has gone in a direction where even the United Nations is questioning whether Iran has not developed or enriched uranium to a point where it becomes very difficult for other countries to push Iran back.
Yes, absolutely. So you're saying that Mr. Biden will be inheriting a problem which is bigger clearly than the wreckage of just a diplomatic document. And also the assassination of this scientist, Mr. Fakhrizadeh, comes at a time when it pushes Iran further, because earlier we've seen the killing of General Soleimani. Now, then there was another incident, and now this is the third one. Before this assassination, Iran was lying low, trying to avoid any provocation which may lead to Trump, which may give Trump a pretext to strike again. But what is the choice that Iran really has now? What are Iran's options? Or do you see this as a win-win for Israel? Because if Iran does not retaliate, then also it serves Israel's purpose. Or we've already seen an assassination earlier, General Soleimani's. If Iran retaliates, it gives America a pretext because Trump is still there. So before he leaves, they may just find an excuse to strike. Another strike may just happen, and like everyone is saying, that it may just flare up the regional conflict. So is it a win-win situation for Israel and does not leave many options for Iran now?
Well, Iran, has always exercised some options. As now the Iranian president has said that we will, has indicated that Iran would retaliate, but a place, in a time of its own choosing. and they also are cognizant of the fact that this may be an attempt to derail Iranian rapprochement, possible rapprochement with the Biden administration. So clearly, they would like to test the waters very, very carefully, because they also, I think, have an interest in giving Mr. Biden a chance, given the state of Iranian economy and given the bigger questions that Iran faces, and given the regional isolation it faces. But I think Iran's the problem, I think, that the region has is, and the questions that have been raised is that Iran has options in terms of what it can do, via the proxies. So whether it is the Houthi rebels in Yemen, whether it is Lebanon, whether it is Syria, in all these countries, in Iraq, Iran is is a very important player in the regional geopolitics. And I think it is that contestation that is driving the larger fault lines in the region. And I would be very surprised if nothing happens from the Iranian side. You may recall after Soleimani's case, also there was a strike, and although some had called it a very carefully calibrated strike when none of the American soldiers died. But I think the Iranians wanted to demonstrate their ability to strike at a time and place of their choosing. So they might retaliate because, again,
but does that give
their proxies.
Does that give Trump a pretext to strike again before he actually leaves office? And
yes, and I think that's the calculation that Iranians will have to make, because I mean, if you read the statement from the from the Iranian president, it seems that he understands that this is being done by those who want to derail the process that may emerge after Mr. Biden comes to office. So I think he's cognizant of that challenge, but whether the domestic situation in Iran will allow him that space remains to be seen. A 1.5 month long time is a long, it's clearly fairly long, and much can happen during that phase. And there'll be many of Iranian adversaries who might want, who might think, who might want to encourage Iran to retaliate, so that a larger regional configuration can happen even before Mr. Biden takes office formally. But I think it's Tehran will have to calibrate and calculate whether they want to start off with Biden on a sour note, or whether they want to give him some time to readjust the realities on the ground, so that a new process can start between Tehran and Washington. And these are clearly very, very difficult questions for Mr. Biden to handle. Would be very, very difficult questions for Mr. Biden to handle immediately. But I don't think there is any any way he can ignore these questions. He would be able to ignore these questions. And as is often said, that Americans may want to get out of Middle East, but Middle East often comes in the way, because there is no way you can really keep it out of American foreign policy discourse and operational realities.
Yes, and Fakhrizadeh's killing complicates the entire situation, because as was described earlier, was mentioned by the Israeli Prime Minister, and he was called the father of the Iran's nuclear policy. He was compared to Oppenheimer, who oversaw the Manhattan Project. So he's a very, very significant person there. Iran clearly will have to probably retaliate, but then it complicates any further negotiation, and a big challenge for Mr. Biden there. Now, if we look at our own External Affairs Minister's visit to UAE and Bahrain and Seychelles, but of course there's been talk of all the cooperation and the Indian diaspora that is living in Bahrain. I was also looking at papers from outside of India, which looks at it and calls it an attempt by India to choke Pakistan in the Middle East. The relationship, the strengthening of ties between India, Bahrain, or India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Modi government's foreign policy is very unambiguous, that it is trying to develop this bond with the GCC countries also. So how do you see this coming together or coming closer of these countries and India?
There is no doubt that Mr. Modi's personal diplomacy with Gulf rulers has opened up new possibilities for India. And I think for a long time, the discourse was largely about India exporting labor and India, and getting oil from the region. I think now the discussions are much more strategic in their orientation, and the idea that the cards perhaps many in India thought India never had in the region have suddenly emerged, and therefore we see strong relatively strong support for India on critical issues, whether it be domestic or whether it is related to Pakistan. So clearly, I think Indian diplomacy has managed to change the trajectory of India's engagement in the region. The challenge is, how do you continue to nurture it, and how do you make the most of the new opportunities that are emerging? Because as we were discussing, Gulf is changing, and it's changing rapidly. It's not simply geopolitical, but it's also geoeconomic. Most of the Gulf states are looking at a post-oil world. They are trying to modernize their economies, and in the process also, very interestingly, modernize their societies and politics. And that opens up, I think, new kinds of conversations that India is having with them about the future of work, about the fourth industrial revolution, about emerging strategic technologies, and how the two countries can therefore collaborate more on these very pragmatic issues, rather than the old ideological ones which had often divided, which had mapped out the landscape for India's engagement. So and therefore I see this constant outreach to the Gulf as a manifestation of that reality. And of course, there is another element which is often missed, is that Western Indian Ocean is becoming so important for India. And when India talks of Indo-Pacific, it is not simply the eastern maritime frontier that India talks about. It's the entire Western Indo-Pacific that is very important for Indian interests, and that continues to be a very salient aspect of India's engagement in the region. So when you're talking of India's engagement with UAE and Bahrain, you're also looking at Seychelles, where Indian External Affairs Minister has been this week, and trying to revive or trying to make India a credible partner for these smaller island nations in the Western Indian Ocean. So I think the larger reality for India is that the Middle East is changing, and India will have to continue to be very, very dynamic in its orientation, but also be cognizant of the fundamental fault lines that exist. And I think the perennial question that often is asked, oh, so what happens to Iran, and where is Iran going? Indo-Iranian relations are going. And I think anyone, if you do an audit of India's engagement in the Middle East, for various reasons, Indo-Iranian relationship has suffered. It has suffered because Iran has been isolated. It has suffered because American sanctions are there. And despite India's best efforts at Chabahar, we have not been able to make it a sustainable project. So I think those questions will linger on. But I think as far as the Arab Gulf states are concerned, I think we do see a sustained attempt at political outreach at the very highest levels. And I think that the fact that it has paid dividends adds to this momentum.
Absolutely. And India's efforts or India's proactiveness has been reciprocated. We've seen a lot of change in the Gulf countries. Like you said, Gulf is changing geoeconomically too. So that's all we have time for this week. Thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh. We'll see you next week. Thank you.